Hello! We are here on a very special episode where we are talking with A.M. Gittlitz,
Hey.
the author of I Want to Believe, the book about posadas and aliens and so much more that we are translating. The book is very dense, as books about communist history goes. It's pretty short and very readable, but it's also very dense. It covers a lot of subjects from cosmism, Soviet sci-fi, to internet culture and memes, and of course a lot about the history of revolutionary socialism in Latin America. So, what basically what made you want to write this book?
I had always been interested in Posadas. I had heard about him in relation to cosmism and biocosmist immortalism, which I was always intrigued by, this Soviet tendency to abolish death and go to space. And Posadas was always sort of associated with that in discussions about that tendency online, message boards and leftist train spotter groups. He didn't really have anything to do with them, but he became sort of the latter day figurehead of that kind of tendency, that sort of futurist cosmist new age tendency within revolutionary socialism. But there was never really that much info about who he actually was, especially written in English. There was some stuff written in Spanish and Portuguese. And I started writing a science fiction story with Comrade Communicator of the Intergalactic Workers League Posadas, which is one of the major Posadas meme pages. And I figured out that the true story was really interesting. There was a lot of lessons in there about the history of revolutionary socialism. And I saw his rise and his fall as being a very good analogy of what happened in the 20th century. And the fact that he's come back today in meme form and inspired so many people made me think that maybe this is a good time to look back at that history and maybe to give people who are fascinated with Posadas like I was a deeper understanding of where those ideas came from. So I just started writing about it. I talked to some publishers, some leftist publishers who were always fascinated in the subject too. And I was lucky enough to get a contract with Pluto to write it. And I worked on it for 3 years, going to archives, interviewing old Trotskyists, people from the party. And so I think I've got a pretty full story of the history of the movement. And then a lot of it is also about how Posadas was rediscovered in pop culture and in memes.
Because the amount of research you did for this book is, from the outside at least, it looked quite immense. I think you used manuscripts, letters in many languages. What was language a barrier for writing this book?
Well, I knew some Spanish going into it, and I was able to read some French and Portuguese. But basically, I was able to, I went through the archives in several different countries, in France and Amsterdam, England, Uruguay, Argentina, and even in California. There are some places I could find some of the documents of the Posadas movement and the Fourth International in general. A lot of it was actually written by an Italian secretary, so he didn't know how to spell the Spanish words. And some of the Spanish that Posadas used was a pretty antiquated Argentinian Spanish related to lunfardo, which is sort of a Creole Spanish spoken by Italians in Argentina. And I sort of taught myself this kind of Trotskyist Argentinian Spanish by doing that. And Posadas, he did not have a formal education. He really did come from a very poor working class background. So his vocabulary was not incredibly sophisticated. So once I was able to kind of learn the jargon that he used, I was able to read his documents pretty clearly. And then when I interviewed some ex-Posadists and some Trotskyists who had run-ins with them who didn't speak English, I was able to record it and slow it down and really do my, with some help from Argentinians, do my best to understand what they were saying. And I think some of it probably was lost in translation, but I think I got, from what I can tell from the reviews, I think I got pretty close to the truth.
What was the reaction from Argentina?
Posadas' son, Leon Cristalli, who now leads the Latin American Bureau and arguably the Posadas International, wanted nothing to do with me. I went to their offices, their local in Buenos Aires, and they closed the door on my face and bragged that they had, slammed the door on the face of an imperialist journalist. because I had written for the New York Times. They have no interest in this phenomena of Posadas online and in memes. They're not trying to capitalize on it. They're not trying to argue with it. They are mostly very old people who were around when Posadas was alive. He died in 1981. So I think that's kind of a shame. I've been waiting for the fatwa to be issued against me by the Posadists, and it just hasn't come. I think maybe they've kind of... I hope that maybe they read it and they appreciate it on some level, but it's possible that they just aren't really interested in the history the way people my age are.
A lot of the book is about not only specifically about Posadas, but about the history of socialism in South America and Latin America. Was this a necessity because it's a history that's not that particularly well known, or it's simply because Argentinian Trotskyists were so involved with the movement, and you had to touch on it a lot?
A necessity to write about the history of Argentina?
Argentina, of course, but you talked about Cuba.
Well, I mean, the history of the Posadas International is the history of Latin American Trotskyism. It was the central tendency of Latin American Trotskyism, arguably between 47 and the mid 60s. For example, in Brazil, most of the Trotskyist organizations can trace their lineage to the Posadas organization. In Cuba, the only Trotskyist group after the revolution were Posadists. That's actually maybe a little bit different today. That's another story. And in Argentina, they were the central group for a while. Later, Moreno became much more central. But the story of Posadism isn't just one of UFOs and nuclear war and dolphins. It's how communists responded to the conditions of post-war Latin America while rejecting the Stalinism of the CP and the sort of third positionism of people like Perón. So it's an important tendency. It was never very large, but it had a lot of influence in the workers' movement for a period of time.
So Trotskyism in Latin America, why is Trotskyism important in Latin America? Why do you need to talk about it? Because in the rest of the world, it's mostly a marginal tendency.
Well, I begin the book talking about anarchism in Argentina because I was really surprised to find that the anarchist movement there was the center of political life in Argentina between 1900 and maybe arguably 1917 or 1920. The Anarchist Communist Union there was the largest and most radical union. All of the proletarian culture, like revered the martyrs of the Haymarket and Malatesta and Kropotkin and all that. And the part of the reason for that was that most of these people were immigrants or the children of immigrants. Argentina didn't mean anything to them. Argentina was kind of a unique country in the sense that it didn't have that strong mestizo culture that a lot of the other Latin American countries had. They mostly killed and drove out the relatively sparse indigenous population, relatively compared to Peru or Bolivia, for example. And so it was mostly just the children of Southern European peasants, people from Spain and Italy. And basically Argentinian patriotism just had to be made up whole cloth. So the generation of Posadas' parents didn't see any value in Argentinian patriotism. They saw Argentina as a region that could be governed by the workers without a state. And it could have. There were revolutionary upsurges largely against the formation of patriotism, but also, to support militant strikes. And this is one of Posadas' first memories in 1919, the Semana Trágica, this militant uprising after some workers were killed at a metal workers strike in Buenos Aires. So through the suppression of this revolutionary wave after 1917, after the Bolshevik Revolution, and by the way, the Bolshevik Revolution inspired a revolutionary wave that included anarchists and communists. A lot of anarchists believed that Lenin was essentially an anarchist. This changed pretty quickly when they learned about how he was treating anarchists throughout the course of the Civil War in Russia. But basically, that dream of anarchism in Latin America kind of went away with the reaction to this revolutionary wave, this creation of patriotism, this creation of a Creole Argentine culture. And it was kind of weird dynamic where like the anarchism was seen as something that your parents did. It seemed almost conservative, like it was an old world thing. And this leads eventually to the rise of Peronism, this extreme nationalist figure, but also it leads to the rise of Stalinism, this like extreme authoritarian, this guy who's supposed to be like the patriarch of the world proletariat. But not everyone believed that Stalin was the best guy to lead the international communist movement. A lot of people recognize, especially through the course of the Spanish Civil War, this is what Posadas learned, was that Stalin did not have the interest of the Spanish proletariat in mind. He had the interest of the Soviet Union in mind. And the Third International was in the interest of Soviet foreign policy. So where do you turn to when anarchism is this distant memory and the communist movement as it currently exists is just the policy of Stalin's Soviet Union? A lot of people turn to Trotsky. Not so much, but a lot of very intelligent intellectual communists and a lot of very militant workers did. And you can see their influence on various workers' movements and various political situations throughout Latin America, even though they never really won any major elections. But one very good example of that is the thesis of Policayo. I think I'm saying that right. In Bolivia, there's an uprising in Bolivia in the early 50s, and the Trotskyist organization there, which was linked with Posadas, basically wrote the manifesto of this miners' workers' revolution, and it was just the Trotsky's transitional program rephrased for the Bolivian indigenous workers' context. And the MNR, when they came to power, used Trotskyists essentially as speechwriters. So Trotskyists, although they never led these massive revolutions, and they never succeeded in their own terms of being the vanguard party of world revolution, they figured out how to have this outsized influence. And this is something the Posadists certainly did. They may have had an organization of 100 people, but they were very diligent and very programmatic, and they were able to influence national politics on some level in pretty much everywhere they had a chapter.
And I imagine that Trotsky ended up in Mexico might have helped.
Yeah, I think it's a good question of, some people from Argentina, a couple of Trotskyists from Argentina did visit him there, but really he was in correspondence with a lot of the intellectuals in Latin America and especially Argentina, because a lot of them, had spent time in France and they were in the surrealist circle and stuff like that. So they were aware of Trotsky even before he came to Mexico, but him setting up shop with Diego Rivera was definitely a major shock throughout the Latin American politics and helped form some sections.
Yeah, and at that point, they weren't really Posadists, right? As nomenclature comes.
I mean, Posadas was always a weird guy, and there was always weird stuff about the organization. That's kind of just true of Trotskyism in general. But really, Posadism begins when Posadas splits from the Fourth International in 61. He sets up his own international. At first, he says this is the real Fourth International, but then shortly after, he calls it the Posadist Fourth International, essentially says that he's, an advancement from Trotsky. And, for a moment, his organization's expanding. It has a lot of power in Brazil, but it comes crumbling down around 65 as a result of some of Posadis' idiosyncrasies and his extreme authoritarian style, which he called monolithism. And once they lose their working class base and a lot of their young cadres, and things stop growing but start contracting in the mid-60s to late 60s, this is when the intellectuals in the Posadas organization start talking about UFOs and stuff like that. But that said, the nuclear war stuff was always part of the Posadas organization. That was something they got from Michel Pablo, who was the secretary of the Fourth International after World War II. This was the mainstream position of Trotskyism in the 50s. But Posadas just took it to a bit more of a chauvinistic degree and held that position that nuclear war was inevitable and desirable for much longer than the rest of the Trotskyists did.
And somehow managed to inspire that sentiment into his followers. Like, I have this this description from Dave Douglas, who embraced the martyrdom of the nuclear fire should it fall on Great Britain. You touch upon Posada's techniques of persuasion. Do you think that's really all there is to how he managed to inspire some of these attitudes in his followers, or
It was a major part of it. Everyone who I've talked to who has talked to him says he was an incredibly charismatic person. And it's something that I won't understand until I've heard audio of him talking. I don't have access to those tapes. But apparently, his speeches, to read them, it's like difficult. It's all over the place. But apparently to hear them, they're very musical, very humorous. He's just a very charismatic guy. I get like some sense of that in some of the things. But yeah, just from reading it transcribed, like what they published in their newspaper, he just sounds like a raving lunatic. And some of like Dave Douglas talks about this a bit in his book about being a British Posadist in the 60s and 70s, that they would have to hand out these lectures from Posadists, and the workers were just like, what is this shit? Like, and they would not let Dave Douglas kind of translate it to be more appropriate for their local context. And that was a huge problem for the Posadists as well. But even those who didn't talk to him personally, I think his involvement, his organization's involvement in Cuba and in Guatemala, and his position on nuclear war made it seem like he was a very militant Trotskyist who was ready and willing to do whatever it takes to create world communism. And in the early 60s, a lot of people thought that was just World War III, that the imperialist states needed to be defeated so the worker states could expand, and that the masses of the world were ready for socialism and communism. It was just they were being held back by the imperialist states. And Posadists seemed like kind of a Guevara figure, and a lot of people thought Guevara might have been a Trotskyist or even a Posadist. So that gained him a lot of popularity in Europe, even among people who had never met him.
That's the thing, because you didn't write only about Posadism and Trotskyism. You also talked about Peron a lot, which I found very, very revealing, and I found that that kind of figure, that Bonaparte's figure, as it gets described in the book, I think it's very also relevant to current day. That kind of synthesis of I don't want to call it populism, of worker demands, and with a strong authoritarian state that forces positions from the left, and very contradictory positions, and creates these kinds of debates, like whether to support him or not.
Yeah, exactly. And at first, of course, the communists and the anarchists despised Peron, and they saw him as a fascist, and they weren't entirely wrong. He was very influenced by Mussolini and the Nazis, but Peron really understood the power of having the workers' movement on his side, and so he co-opted it over a period of a few years, to the point when Peron was imprisoned by the dictatorship that he himself was a part of. The Central Union Argentina, the CGT, called this major strike to defend the gains of the Peronist era. But the demonstration ended up happening a day before the strike, and instead of being about the working class issues, it was about Peron. And it was one of the largest uprisings in the history of Argentina. It could have been a revolution had they not released Peron from prison and allowed him to run for president. So communists like Posadas and like Guillermo Almira, who was one of the founders of the Posadas movement, recognized that to oppose the Peronist movement was to oppose the working class of Argentina. So while they were always critical of Peron, and while they always wanted the working class to supersede the bureaucracy of Peron's CGT, the Peron's leadership of the workers' movement, they understood that he was beloved by the people because he was moving their demands forward in a way that the traditional elites of Argentina would not do. And a big part of this, of course, was that Europe was ruined after the war. They no longer could have such lopsided terms with the colonial and semi-colonial world. So Peron, like Cardenas in Mexico, like basically every leader in Latin America at the time, was able to basically get out of the really predatory trade agreements and nationalize things and build a lot of infrastructure and public works and sort of modernize in a variety of ways. And once Europe recovered all those regimes, come tumbling down one after another, including Perón in 55. So really, as savvy as he was politically, as unique as he was, he was really taking advantage of favorable economic conditions. And so when Perón was removed, once again, Posadas kind of flipped and celebrated his removal as some kind of victory. But that was a short-lived political position, because for the next almost 20 years, the left and the right of the workers' movement in Argentina was united in calling for Perón to return, this sort of messianic return that ended up being, of course, a total disaster for the left. But yeah, the position that Posadas took on this made the Posadist organization in Argentina very central and important to the Latin American Trotskyist movement. They really had kind of the right analysis, you could say, for the time, and they became the Latin American section, the Latin American bureau of the Fourth International until the end of the 50s for that reason.
I think the notion of a figure at the head of a movement is present in the book. Like you describe a moment where the dual structure of the party led some to describe the Posadist International as a quasi-anarchistic party of autonomous cadres, with Posadas merely its symbolic, perhaps semi-fictional leader. This the symbolic leader is something that seems important. Like you mentioned Che Guevara, there's Subcomandante Marcos, of course. In a way, Perón. I don't know. It's there's something to be said about the figure of a leader that embodies a movement.
Yeah, this was, I think, the Posadas at his best. Was he was just this charismatic guy who was kind of the arbiter of a group of intellectuals with differing opinions. This is what Grupo Cuarta Internacional, the first Posadist organization, was. He was the leader of the group, but he was not the greatest intellectual. He was not the most well-read. He was not a writer, but he was a worker. He was very charismatic, and he was a great propagandist, a great paper pusher. You know, the paper came out, the journals came out, they distributed them. He was very good at those things. And when he functioned as just the head of a group of intellectuals who basically, you know, they would write something and it would be signed Posadas. It would be signed with this collective pseudonym, essentially, that represented Homero Cristalli, which is Posadas' real name. Posadas was a very functional figure. But in the 60s, he becomes a typical megalomaniac, and he wants total power for himself. He begins to distrust the intellectuals in the group because they know that his positions aren't right, you know? So they begin to challenge him on his takes, his position on the Prague Spring, for example. And it gets to the point where he's punishing the intellectuals in the movement, separating them from their spouses, believing that if they don't have sex, their libido will be channeled into the revolutionary movement, sending them to you mentioned the quote from Dave Douglas. Some cadres were so removed from Posadas that they could live and think the way they wanted to, more or less. And he sent leadership to go and set them straight so they could live more like Posadas. And eventually he just kicks all the intellectuals out in the mid-70s because he doesn't want anyone questioning him at all. So Posadas, that collective, almost mythical, semi-fictional figure, just becomes Homero Cristalli, and that's when the movement really dies.
Yeah. To what extent do you think that these idiosyncrasies, these cruelties, really started off simply as punishments that then get justified through ideological and sort of theoretical justifications? Like you said, that the absence of sexual intercourse will will channel the libido into revolutionary action.
Well, I mean, like Posadas's extreme monolithism, you could argue that comes from Lenin. Like, the Leninist party is supposed to be democratic centralist. It's impossible to argue the Posadists were democratic, but it's often the case that democratic centralism is much more centralist than it is democratic. So Posadas was not unique in that regard. And in general, Bolshevik organizations tend to replicate a military structure in certain ways. So the militants in an organization are supposed to really live their life for the party, for the movement, for the revolution. And to do that, you have to be disciplined. So it's not unusual for militant organizations to make certain demands about your lifestyle, about your diet, your sexuality, how you spend your free time, how you spend your money. So although Posadas like really took that to an extreme degree where it just appeared to be a typical cult, it was not unusual, certainly not in the 70s, where a lot of new communist movements were doing exactly what Posadas was doing, arguably better or worse in terms of the abuse of the base. But some have argued that just in general, if a Leninist organization is doing their job properly, if they're disciplining their militants properly, it will be something like a cult. And one could argue that kind of discipline is necessary if we're trying to create this massive project of international proletarian revolution. And even if it is, I just don't think people are willing to do that anymore. I don't think people like to be led. People don't like to be leaders in the same way that they used to. People know what cults are and don't like. There's a bit of like curiosity and attraction to them, but people don't want to be in cults. So I think what seems so strange now that people would fall into these communist cults like the Posadists in the 60s and 70s, it's because it's unthinkable now that you would submit yourself to that kind of discipline, even the basic discipline that's necessary to be a Trotskyist or a Stalinist or what have you, or even an anarchist. Anarchists have this kind of discipline as well.
Yeah, but I think there's a bit of a difference in the having to apply a degree of discipline, even an extreme degree of discipline, and I don't know, accepting that it's for a tactical and strategic objective, and having that discipline justified by these almost mystical beliefs that they end up. This is what I was asking. Like, I think, why do you think he ended up justifying this need for discipline, for party discipline, in the way he did?
Well, you basically said it. There was a move towards mysticism, and that is a sort of natural effect of the revolutionary situation that birthed Leninism and birthed the Fourth International disappearing. So, Trotsky's concept of the Fourth International was that World War II would produce a world revolution that would overcome Stalinism and overcome imperialism, and that it would need leadership, and the Trotsky's Fourth International would supply that leadership. So after the war, the Trotskyists say, well, maybe the war isn't really over, or maybe it's about to begin again, and it'll be a nuclear war. And after the nuclear war, the Fourth International needs to be there to provide leadership. 50s come and go. Trotskyists kind of stop thinking this way, but Posadas doesn't. So he has to jump through a lot of ideological hurdles to try to continue to justify having the same position that he had in the late 40s, in the 70s. And what he says is basically that it's no longer the case that material conditions create ideas. It's now the other way around, that everybody has the right ideas. The working masses, the peasants, the colonized people of the world are ready for socialism. They know how to do it. They saw what happened in Russia. They're reading Posadas, like he really believed that he was much farther widely read than he was. And all that needs to happen is this collapse of the imperialist world order through nuclear war or what have you. And then people could finally take power. It's a mystical idea. It's a doomsday fantasy. It's a messianic fantasy. Posadas was not the first Marxist to have these messianic fantasies. Marx himself flirted with messianism at times. So these things are always there in the history of the revolutionary movement, but at times they become far more tactical and rooted in reality. And when revolution seems so far away and like such a fantasy, then that's the kind of politics you're going to get. That's the kind of groups you're going to get. They're going to be kind of mystical.
I don't know if you wanted to present it like this, but when you talk about how Jose Rega, Peron's successor, sort of, used similar mystical thinking, like the mind transfer ceremony.
Yeah.
Did you want to contrast, I don't know, Posadas' mysticism, like as a pathology of powerlessness, with these right-wing mysticisms as a pathologies of power?
Yeah, exactly. I wanted to kind of show the weirdness of this messianic return kind of thinking that like all that's lacking is Perón returning or like the regeneration of the Bolshevik base of the Soviet Union. You know, it's like these things that are always imminent, these like very specific things that are imminent and will change everything, and it's just not true. Perón returning did not put Argentina any closer to socialism. Quite the opposite. The end of the Soviet Union, the fall of the Soviet bureaucracy, did not make Russia and Romania communist countries or socialist countries. Quite the opposite. And so obviously, I'm much more sympathetic to these left-wing communist fantasies of Posadas than I am towards the fascist ideas of Rega, but I was just trying to look at the way people were thinking politically in the 70s, this parapolitical thought, this kind of mystical thought, just to show that this was in the air back then, and as it is in the air somewhat today with the way people talk about what's going on behind the scenes of world power, just to sort of demystify it and show it for what it is, which is, you know, kind of a distraction from the material realities of the day-to-day class struggle.
But I think, in a way, even how right-wing movements react today, when they do get power and when they do get basically absolute power, they still lose their minds. Like I think we've seen that with reactionaries in the U.S. With Trump, especially the later part of the term. I think.
What specifically you're talking about?
Q, for example.
Yeah, yeah. So Q is a great example of parapolitical thinking. Like, you know, Trump comes in and he's supposed to be this messianic figure who's going to change everything, make America great again, get rid of the pedophiles and the Democrats or whatever. And really, he's just kind of a normal, you know, he's not normal, but he's basically just governing as a Republican, not so different from Bush, not really so different than Obama. And so if you had this messianic fantasy about Trump, you're going to have to cope. You're going to have some sort of illusion to replace the disillusionment of nothing changing despite your messiah coming into power. And that's what the Q phenomena is. They're saying, well, all that stuff is happening secretly behind the scenes. And, you know, it's the day of reckoning is still coming. And it's no coincidence that these people tend to be evangelical Christians, because that has always been sort of the moral justification of the power structure in the United States, because we can't face directly that power structure because we would have to be critical of it. And failing to be critical of it, we have to create some sort of ridiculous fantasy.
Like ironically invoking Posadas and the space comrades.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think that's why people are so interested in aliens, is that they see how ridiculous things are on Earth and how bizarre it is that we can't get our shit together as a species. Like we got our shit together enough to, you know, create the technology to destroy the world, but not enough to figure out how to not destroy the world. And if you think about what that looks like from the perspective of an alien civilization who has the technology to travel light years, it looks really stupid. So even though we're supposed to be afraid of aliens, like, you know, the Independence Day narrative that they're coming to wipe us out and eat us or whatever, people my age and younger think like, well, if aliens exist or if they don't, they're probably smarter than us. So I kind of identify with them, ironically, way more than I identify with the powers that be on our planet, the intellectuals on our planet, or the leaders.
I'm not thank you. I'm not a Marxist-Leninist. I'm just asking questions. In the book and even in this discussion, you kind of present authoritarianism as sort of unavoidable kernel at the core of Marxism-Leninism and Trotskyism and maybe Marxism in general. But like, isn't that authoritarianism a function of the movement being under attack? Like when you discuss Cuba becoming more authoritarian, you say that it's after Castro became convinced that the US won't stop attacking him in various ways.
Yeah, but I mean that's a justification for liberalism. You know, you could say like, well, we need to have We need to have a certain amount of social repression and, carceral institutions, or else the underclass are just going to rise up as a mob and overrun everything. So that kind of fear of the average everyday person as a ignorant brute whose impulses need to be contained is the basis of the world order. Now, I'm not saying that to polemicize authority in general. I'm not against authority. I'm not even necessarily, obvious as any Marxist. I'd like to see a world without states and classes, but I'm not trying to be too dogmatic about the idea that nobody should ever support any concept of a state or any politician or any kind of leader today. I'm more making this critique of the fetishization of authority, which I don't think you really get to that too much in Marx. That is something that really is rooted in Marxism-Leninism and the way Marxism-Leninism was reified through Stalinism. And, Trotsky absolutely has a hand in that. He was in the leadership of the Soviet Union until 1927. So he's not without blame. But the larger point I was trying to make, aside from what my politics are, is that people my age aren't interested in being part of these organizations, even if they consider themselves a Stalinist or a Leninist. People who have read What Is to Be Done in State of Revolution and will defend it will not submit themselves to the kind of discipline that Lenin is describing, because that is just not. I know other places in the world is a different story. I'm talking about my experiences in the United States, and maybe you can tell me about some of your thoughts on this in Romania. But in the United States, nobody wants to live this disciplined militant life. And very few people are even interested in taking that kind of leadership, which is a huge part of Trotskyism and Marxism-Leninism, that the crisis of the proletariat is a crisis of leadership. And we need to create the proper leadership and the proper militant organization to enact the will of the leadership. So whether or not it has its place or it's justified, it's impossible. And, Cuba is a whole nother story about what Cuba is like today, what its policy goals are today, in what way it can said to be socialist or communist, what its strategy is. I'd love to have that conversation, but that's a really long one.
Yeah. My experience, I really don't know about wanting to become a leader. I think it's a bit of a cliche, but I think that people who want to be leaders don't really should be leaders. I think you have something deranged in your brain if you want to lead others, if this is a goal of yours in life. I was a member of a party inspired by the experiences of Occupy Wall Street, Podemos, Syriza, like this new wave of political parties and organizations, sort of inspired by the autonomists. That you also write about a bit, these horizontal organizations, and I found it very authoritarian as well. But
that's interesting.
And by the end, cultish also. But the authoritarianism wasn't stated. It was an undercurrent, but and that was very psychologically taxing. The leader was the one taking the decisions, but he was taking those decisions after he basically made us simulate debate and deliberative practices and so on. But still, he basically, when the debate was started, his decision was already made, and by the end of the debate, we were going with his decision. And it was a very, as I said, it was psychologically taxing. And by the end, as the movement decayed and became stale, he surrounded himself with people who basically, whatever he would decide, they would agree with him. And they had absolutely no ideological coherence. Like one person was basically a Christian Democrat, basically no relationship with the left whatsoever.
Right. This is sort of my point, is like that guy in another time could have just been the leader, could have just said, like, I'm the leader, do what I say. And he would have found some people to do what he said, like Posadas did. But now you have to dress it up in this pretense of there being no leadership or being this democratic structure. and you just have to plow your way through with like endless debate and manipulation, and then in the process of that, everyone just gets alienated and turned off and depoliticized and burnt out because the entire pretense of it being democratic and empowering is a lie. And so like that's not the fault of any like ideology of what the organization was, or like the way the organization was structured. Or, you know, a lot of people will say like, well, this is like a toxic guy, he's abusive or whatever. I think even if he wasn't, even if he was really right, and even if he did everything the right way, people just don't want to submit to that kind of authority anymore. That's kind of my theory. And so, although people kind of like the idea of having a figurehead like Bernie Sanders in the United States, maybe you guys liked Giannis Varoufakis or something like that.
No.
Okay, well, that's good.
There are some people who like him, but he's not incredibly popular.
You know what I mean? Like the idea of like a charismatic person coming up is exciting to people, but then when it comes down to submitting to them, people get turned off, and that's why cults don't do as well as they did in the 70s. And that's certainly why we just don't see, although Stalin and Lenin are popular in memes, we do not see the emergence of like a big new communist parties. It's just the same old bullshit micro sects and, you know, dinosaur CPs from 30 years ago, 50 years ago.
Like, I don't know, my experience maybe I'm just traumatized, but I think I want structure. So I want the power relationships to be visible. I don't think we can escape them. I want the power relationships to be visible, and I think it's much more dangerous to pretend that they're not there.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, Occupy had kind of a nice idea. I don't know if this made it to Europe, but in the United States, we had a slogan of a leaderful movement. And I don't know to the extent that was ever actualized during Occupy, but I like the idea that it's not wrong to be a leader, but you just have to make sure everyone can be a leader, or like try to make sure everyone can be a leader. Everyone feels empowered to take charge of the situation, that you're not getting in the way of people who are ready to take some initiative, that you're kind of assertively working together from a several different angles, that you don't need to agree on one central demand, and that ultimately you're in this conflict with the power structure from below, and that's kind of what the struggle is. And it doesn't need to be defined by this like program and long strategy. I think that's kind of the right idea. So I think Occupy was onto something, and I think we're seeing it play out in these more autonomous, improvised struggles that kind of come in waves. And they absolutely lack the coherence of the Fourth International, you know, but they're far more powerful than any Leninist organization today.
Oh, another thing I really appreciated about the book was this excavation of various other currents from the Bolshevik movement. Like Bogdanov specifically, but also the Cosmists and various other strains. Because I think there is a tendency of in online discourse, especially of fixing everything in that moment, especially in the embryonary phase before the revolution and a bit during it. To Lenin, like everything about the Bolsheviks was everything the Bolshevik movement was or could have been or was Lenin, and I think it's interesting that you pull a few strains that contradict him or go against him.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's been a lot of interest over the last several years in what Bogdanov thought besides his sci-fi theories, and I think it goes to, it's going to be a hard thing for me to just explain it in an improvised fashion, but Lenin had this idea that there needs to be this professional intellectual vanguard that was able to essentially discover the way forward and, you know, the deeper truth of the struggle. Whereas Bogdanov believed that the working class was sort of producing and recognizing and coming to consciousness through their day-to-day encounters with class struggle. And this sort of debate of this kind of, you could say, more horizontal versus vertical view of the progression of revolutionary struggle consumed the Bolsheviks between 1905 and 1910. And Lenin polemicized Bogdanov as a mystic for some of his beliefs about physics and Machian physics. And he was able to use that to say that Bogdanov was just not a good scientist, that he believed that material was maybe a more difficult concept than just like there are these objective objects that we can touch and, but you could certainly argue that Bogdanov was far more dialectical with how he was understanding physics and understanding culture. But really, it comes down to just a political disagreement over who is the leadership of the revolution. Is it these professional militants or is it the class itself? But of course, Bogdanov is mostly talked about as this sci-fi guy who experimented with blood transfer. But Lenin's polemic against him, materialism and imperial criticism, was something the Posadists were reading and thinking about in the late 60s, and it led to their alien discussion, and it led to how they organized the party in this monolithic fashion. So again, Bogdanov, a marginal figure who's remembered as kind of a meme, for writing about Mars and blood transfer. But in reality, in history, he was kind of important to the trajectory of revolutionary socialism.
Yeah, and he's mostly remembered by from things that his adversaries wrote about him. Like Posadas himself, you say that when he got rediscovered, he got basically through the mockery that other parties were throwing at him.
Yeah, I mean, he became a joke pretty fast. The Trotskyists obviously all hated him once he split, because that was a huge chunk of the Fourth International he took with him. Yeah, as he became the leader of his own Fourth International, he got very weird. And so it was very exciting in 1968 when this essay about UFOs was published, and all the Trotskyists who read the Posadist press exactly for something like that, spread that around and made it into a meme at the time that the Posadists were, UFO lovers. But the joke, I think, historically was a little bit on them, because people remember Posadists, but people don't remember these other tendencies or don't care about them. And in fact, at times, Posadists in the United States and England was Googled more than even Trotsky. So the fact that he did believe these interesting things and he was an idiosyncratic figure has given him this kind of staying power, has put him into the socialist canon in a way that a figure like Michel Pablo was not. Or, even Ernst Mandel, such an important Marxist. Just, not someone that these young socialist memesters know about or care about.
Yeah.
And these people might be, important political figures one day. They're young now, but one day they might become important, leading some kind of movement or revolution or what have you. And in their history, they will have some Posadist memes.
Yeah. So I think as a conclusion, so for me at least, one of the very important things that your book does is it enlarges our imagination, our horizon of revolutionary vision, not through speculative fiction, not through how Bogdanov did it by imagining his Mars civilization, but by excavating these figures, maybe these possible futures, possible ideologies, some things that could have been, because they are in our history. There are things that we know should be possible.
That's very nice of you to say. Thanks so much.
Thank you for coming on, for being so gracious with your time.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Those are really good questions.